So before I get started adding CSS to my project, I'm actually going to make a copy of the project. And so you don't have to do this. You can just continue working on the project that you have. But as I make new demos, I like to keep the old versions intact so you can see kind of what we covered in these different sections. And so if you want to make copies, you can do that as well. And I'm going to do something similar to what I showed last week in terms of how you guys can actually fork the projects that I create. So when I have a project like this, I'm on the Replit homepage in this folder that I created. And if I click on here, I can make a fork of this project. And what that means is it's going to make a copy of the project, but I can make changes to it, and so I can keep the original project intact. So I'm going to click on that menu item there, or this 3-dot menu here, and then click on fork. And so I'm going to call this one CSS intro, and I'm going to click fork. And so now I'll have two projects in that folder. And so when I add CSS to my new project, it's not going to overwrite the old project that I had. So now we can get started adding some CSS. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. I'm going to cover what I consider and what most people consider kind of like the best approach. You will find other approaches. But the simplest approach is to have one CSS page that applies to all of your web pages. So we have, besides our home page, which is the index.html, that's our main page for our website, we have two other pages. And instead of styling each one of those pages individually, one of the sort of advantages of the design of CSS and the way the web works is that we can create one style sheet that applies the same styles to each one of those pages. But in order to do that, we have to be a little bit careful about the way that we reference the style sheet in our HTML. And so that's what we're going to cover first, and it'll be also a chance to kind of review a little bit how our file system works. So I'm just going to start by creating a CSS document, and then I'll create a couple simple rules to add styling to our website. And then we'll look at how do we apply those rules, or how do we apply that style sheet to all of our pages. So to start, I'm going to go up to my file system here and click New File. And I'm going to call this style.css. This is typically what you would call your sort of like main CSS file. Depending on how your website is designed, how complicated it is, you might have many CSS files, in which case you would name them after sort of the functionality that they have. But this is our main style sheet, so we're just going to call it style.css. Our website is going to be very simple. It just disappeared for some reason, so I'm going to try that again. Maybe I have to hit enter. I think I just clicked on it. Okay, if I hit enter, there we go. So now we've created it. I'm going to turn my little AI guy off for a second so I can just go over some of the basics. And so when we create a style sheet, we can write a style. I'm just going to write a very simple style, and then we'll see how do we actually get that style to apply to our web page. And so when we write a style in CSS, there's a few parts to that. So I'm going to make a little comment and describe those parts here. In CSS, when we write comments, it looks a little bit different than how it looks in HTML. So to make a comment, this is a thing that it gets ignored by the browser. So we can just make notes here. So I might make a note like to other developers. I might make a note just so I can remember something in the future. But for now, I'm just going to write a little note about CSS syntax. So CSS syntax. So the basic CSS syntax, we start with what's called a selector. This is like the name for one of our HTML elements. So I'm actually going to move my CSS window over here for a second. And I'm going to move this up here. And so we have a selector. And so that is any HTML element that we would see on the page. So it's things like the body, h1, paragraph, or anchor tag. Those are all the different types of HTML tags. And so a CSS selector selects one of those tags so that we know where to apply the style. Okay, so selector selects an HTML tag like h1, paragraph, anchor, etc. Okay, so then inside the selector we have a property and then a value. So a property is some aspect of the style of that selector. So that could be the color, the size, different things like that. So this is a aspect of the style, like color or size. And then, whoops, Replit is doing some things that I don't want it to do, even though I'm inside of a comment, so that's okay. And then finally we have a value. And a value is just the value that we give that property. So if the property is a color, the value could be red or blue. If the property is a size, the value could be a number of pixels or a percentage of the website page. So a value is the what we assign to the property. Value is assigned to the property. For example, color could be red or blue. So there are lots and lots of properties, there are lots and lots of selectors, there are lots and lots of values, and these kind of change in different contexts. So we don't really have time to go over every single one. What I'm going to do is go over a couple, but then also talk about the way that we usually find these things. So if we want to create a specific look, how do we figure out how to do that look? So when we write our CSS rule, so a CSS rule looks like this. We have a selector, and then we have some curly brackets. Curly brackets are a special type of bracket that we use in code a lot. And you can see them on your keyboard. They're sort of next to the P key. And in Replit and most text editors, if I hit Shift and type an open curly bracket, it's usually going to make the closed curly bracket for me because it knows that I'm going to add that eventually. So to write a CSS rule, we use the name of the selector. We add some curly brackets, and then we use a property followed by a value, and we can add as many rules as we want. So we have a property, and then a colon, followed by a value, and then a semicolon. So that allows us to separate all of the different properties and values in one rule. So we can also have another property. So maybe we have property 1 and property 2, and they each have different values. So again, it's not possible to cover every single selector, every single property, every single value. There's tons and tons and tons of them. And no developer memorizes all these things. What we need to understand is the basic setup so that if we want to change the property of something, we can figure out how to look it up. So let's start with something simple. What I want to do is I want to change the background color of my entire website. So to do that, I'm going to use the main HTML tag for the whole website, which is the body. And so to set up this rule, I would type body. That's my selector. Then I would type 2 curly brackets, which I can do in Replit, again, and most text editors just by hitting 1 curly bracket. It's usually going to add the second one for me. And then I hit enter to make a new space. And this is just a stylistic thing. It doesn't change the way that the rules work, but it makes it much easier to read. And then I'm going to add my property and the value. So I know most of the properties that we're going to use, but you may not know them. So if we need to know a property, it's very easy just to Google it. You could also probably use the generative AI if you wanted to. You could probably, if I turn this back on, actually I bet it's going to say something here. Or maybe if I hit Alt-G. Oh, I guess, there we go. Okay, so you can see it's actually giving me a whole bunch of different properties. But I'm going to ignore this and go over how I would do it if I was looking for something specific. The difference, of course, with the generative AI is it's just kind of guessing what I want to put. But if I know what I want to do, it's easier just to look it up. So I'm going to go to a new tab and say CSS background color. So I want to change the background color for my entire website. And you're very likely going to see a few different websites. One is W3 Schools. Another is Mozilla. And you may also see, I actually don't see it here, but if you look up something more complicated, what you'll often see is the website csstricks.com. And we'll probably see that later as we look for more things. And then, of course, you'll also see Stack Overflow. So different people have different preferences for where they find the answers to these questions. My preference is for Mozilla. They're the people who actually are in charge of HTML and CSS to some extent. And they're the people who invented JavaScript and other web technologies. So I tend to trust their information, but you'll probably be able to find basically the same information on any one of these websites. Anyway, we can click on this link and it'll show us an example, and it'll usually even show us some code that we can copy and paste into our CSS page. So we see background color looks like this. That's the property. And this is one of the values, brown. We can also see this is a hex value. That's a different way of storing a color. We can see an RGB value. We can see a couple other different color values. So we'll look a little bit more at that in a second, but let's go ahead and take one of these. So I'm just going to copy this, and there's actually a little button here. And I'm going to go back to my Replit page and hit Command V to paste. Looks like that copy didn't work. Let's try that again. Okay, it still didn't work. Let's try Command C, Command V. Okay, there we go. So now we should have a brown background color, but I'm going to move my style sheet over here for a second. I'm going to refresh my page, and we're going to see that that didn't work. And the reason is we haven't connected our style sheet to our HTML page. So this is what we're going to do next. So in order to tell this index.html page where to find the style sheet, we need to create a reference in our HTML. So we need to connect the two documents. So I'm going to go back to index.html. And to make this connection, I use something that's a little bit like a link, but we're not actually going to a different page. We're loading the information from that page into our HTML. And so the tag that I use for this is called a link tag. It's a little confusing because you would think that a link tag would be a hyperlink, but it's actually just a link to a different document. So we need a link tag. This needs, like a hyperlink, it needs a reference. So it uses a hypertext reference. And the reference goes to our style.css. So when I hit the equals sign for my href attribute, it gives me some options, and I want style.css. That syntax is not right, though, because we need some quotation marks. So when we're writing an attribute, we need quotation marks. So again, Replit gives you these suggestions. They're not always exactly right. So we need to add some quotation marks, and now this should work. But we actually need to add a couple more attributes to the link tag so that the HTML page knows how to use it. So one of those attributes is called the relationship tag, and this basically says what the relationship between these two documents is, and the shorthand is REL, and the relationship is that this is a style sheet. So I just type in style sheet there, and then I'm going to add in the type attribute, which just tells it which type of document it's looking at, and that type is text/CSS. So once you've written this, you really don't have to do anything else. We can refresh this page, and we see we have this beautiful brown. It really looks kind of red to me on my computer, but it's brown background. You might not like brown, so let's look for some other colors. There's a couple different ways that we can do this. One easy way, if we go back to our style sheet, Replit actually has a color picker built directly into the coding editor, which is a feature that a lot of editors have added recently. So if I click on here, I can drag my thing around and try to find a different color that might be more appropriate for a background color, maybe like a light blue. And if I hit enter, it will add in this value, which is known as a hex value. And so if I refresh the page, Now I have this light blue background that's probably more appropriate for what I would want to do. Another way to look for colors is to use a website. There's a lot of different websites that do this, but the one that I tend to use is called HTML Color Codes. So this is htmlcolorcodes.com. And the reason I like this site is because it shows me all of the different types of values. So as I mentioned, when we're writing CSS, we have properties and then we have values, but our values can be of different types. And this one kind of shows us the different types. There are names, there are hex values, and there are RGB values, and there are also HSL values. So there's also a nice big color picker, so I can move this around and find a color that I like, and it will tell me, sorry, there's a lot of moving parts. It has a bunch of annoying ads. Let's try to get rid of those. Okay, so now we can see all the values that capture this color. So as I change the color, we see those values update. And we can choose those values. So I won't go into too much detail when it comes to like the math behind these things, but RGB is something that we're already familiar with from our lessons on Photoshop. This is just the mixture of red, green, and blue that go into that color. So if I have a very red color, you can see the RGB is 255, or the highest value, whereas the green and blue are the lowest values. The hex value is another way of writing RGB. It uses letters to increase the number of characters that you can use to capture a color. And so you can see every hex value is just 6 characters, which saves a little space on the computer, versus an RGB, which can have up to 3 characters for each value. So for example here, the RGB value has 9 characters, whereas the hex value has 6 characters. So you save a little space on the hard drive. It's probably not that significant for what we're doing, but just to explain what's happening there. The other thing that's nice on this website is if you go to HTML color names, there are built-in HTML color names. And so you can scroll down to a color that you're looking for, green or blue or whatever. And then there are sort of default colors that HTML supports. There's no real reason to use this over another color, but you can find colors that you might like, and then those will work in your style sheet. So maybe this light steel blue looks kind of nice. I can copy that and replace this color value with light steel blue. And it looks almost the same. I chose basically a pretty similar color, but we have this nice descriptive value. So rather than a number that you might not automatically understand what it means, we have a very specific color that you might have an association with. Okay, so that's one property. Let's add a couple more properties, and then we will attach our style sheet to our other pages. So besides the background color, we can also change the font color. And to do that, this is just the term color. And you can see that Replit kind of gives us a bunch of suggestions for different colors. I could try bisque and see what that looks like. That's probably going to be too light. Actually, that doesn't look so bad. I might want to make that a little bit darker since my background is very light. That actually looks not too bad. Maybe I'll make this a little more orange. This is getting kind of poop colored. Let's try like somewhere around here. A little too dark. Let's try that. Okay, that looks pretty decent. So we can change the color, and notice that it changes the color of all of my text except for my links. My links have a default color, and unless I write a rule specifically for the links, that color is not going to change. So we'll do that in a little bit. We can also set things like the size of the text. So I could say font size, and I could change the size of the text. You can do this in terms of the number of pixels on the screen. So if I set it to like 50 pixels, I use the number 50, and then px is the abbreviation for pixel. And you can see that makes the default font size very, very large. That's too large for the website, obviously. So let's make it a little smaller. Let's try 20 pixels. that's a little bit more reasonable. It may be a little too big. The default size is 16. So if I want it to be a little bit bigger but not too crazy, maybe I'll go with 18 pixels. Okay, so that looks pretty good. You might notice that while I set the font size to 18 pixels, we can see that the header and the paragraph actually have different font sizes. And so that has to do with, again, with the defaults of those rules. And so we'll get to that in just a second. We'll set individual rules for our different tags. Now I kind of feel like the orange is too bright. I'm going to try a less saturated color. Let's try that. That's pretty good. Okay, anyway. One last rule before we add some more stuff. We can also change the font family. And this is how we change like the main typography of the site. There's a couple of things that we have to go over here. So again, a lot of these rules, you might not know off the top of your head that font size is how you change the text size. So it's the kind of thing that you should just Google and then find the answer. So if we want to change the typography, I might say something like this, CSS change typography. And typography is just a long word for font. And so we're going to see on MDN, we're going to see some different rules. This actually looks quite complicated, but if we scroll down, you can see all the different properties. So there's font family, font size, font stretch, font style, font variant, font weight, line height. You could kind of guess what these things do, but if you're not sure, you can just click on them. And font family is the one that's probably the most sort of ambiguous, but this is just the typographic font that you use for the site. And so we can, let's copy this rule here, or let's see if there's some other ones that we like more. We can go with this first one. So I'll copy that and paste it in here. And if I refresh, now you see it's a different font. It's not the most exciting font in the world, but we do get, a more specific font. There's another website called CSS Font Stack that's really useful for our default web fonts. And the reason it's useful is it shows us all the different fonts we can use for a website by default, but it also shows us the compatibility of those fonts. So it divides the fonts into two categories, sans serif and serif. If you have not studied typography at all before, you may not be familiar with these terms. Sans serif basically refers to fonts that don't have the little feet. So serif means it has these little feet. So you can see the serif fonts are the more sort of traditional looking fonts, like Times New Roman, Georgia, things like that that you would see like in a newspaper or a book. Sans serif, sans is French for without, so sans serif just means without serifs. Those fonts don't have the little feet, so they look more modern. They look like things you would see in like an advertisement on the subway. All the New York subway signs use sans serif fonts, so these fonts have more of a modern look. The fonts also show you what percentage of devices support those fonts. So not every font is supported by every platform. So for example, Arial is a very common font. The support on Windows is 99%, and the support on Mac is 98%. So you're pretty, safe using Arial as your default font. This avant-garde font has 0% support on Windows and 1% support on Mac. So you probably can't use that font. It's probably not going to show up correctly on all of the devices. This one, Franklin Gothic, has 99% support Windows, 2% support Mac. And so, if you are just making a website for Windows, which is not super likely, you could go with that one. But if you need to support Mac, you would need to actually install that font. So we'll look at one more thing before we go back, and that's how can we actually add a font into our website so that we don't have to worry about whether or not a platform supports it. So there's a bunch of different services for this. I'm going to use Google Fonts. So I'm just going to type in Google Fonts, and it's going to come up here. This is just fonts that are made accessible by Google, and it's very easy to add these into your website. And when you add a font into your website like this, then it will work regardless of what platform the website is being loaded on. And so it does take a little longer for the website to load, but you don't have to worry about whether it'll be supported. So the fonts website is pretty useful. I can type like, you know, a preview and see how it looks in various different fonts. I can also add some filters. Like I could say I want something like a slab serif. I can look at various properties. So I can kind of like play with these different fonts. You can see there's 1,500 different fonts. So that's a lot of different fonts to work with. And let's choose a nice looking font. Maybe this rocket font is kind of fun. And so to add this to our website, we have to, let's see, they kind of changed the website a little bit, but when we scroll down here, we can see the different variations of the font. So there, for each font, there may be a few variations, like regular versus a heavier bold font, or a lighter light font or thin font. So let's just go with the regular. And if I click on this button, it's going to open up this this sidebar where it'll actually show me how to add this font into my CSS style sheet. So the one that I want to use here is this @import, and it actually just makes a CSS rule here. You can ignore these style brackets. That's if you were adding your CSS styles directly into your HTML. So I'm just going to copy this here, or actually I'm just going to copy this import part. And the important thing to remember here is that this has to go before I use any of the rules. So I would put this like before I try to use it right here. And then it also shows me how to use it in the page, which is right here. So I would write font family and then quotation marks rocket and then the backup font. So the comma sort of means if this font doesn't load for some reason, use a serif as a backup font. So I can copy this. And for this one, let's actually add this only to our H1. So we'll change the font of just the header, not the rest of my website. So to do this, I would make a new tag after the body, and I would make an H1, and then I'm just going to paste that rule in there. And so now you'll see that this font will apply only to my H1. Okay, so we've already covered a bunch of stuff. I'm going to go over two more things. How do we connect this to the rest of our pages? And then how do we test our rules? And how do we update our rules? So you can see that on our home page, our CSS is working. But if I go to one of our other pages, suddenly the CSS is gone. And that's because I haven't connected the CSS to all of my pages. So I need to make sure it's connected everywhere. So I'm going to go back to index.html. I'm going to copy this link that I created. So I'm just going to select that and hit Command C to copy. And then I'm going to go to my dog page and go to the head section and paste it here. Also, I think I forgot to mention the reason we put this in the head section is because we want to load all of the styles before we load the body content. It doesn't actually really matter where you put this, but this is just kind of the convention that it goes up in the head section with our other meta information. Okay, so I'm going to reload this, and it's still not going to work. And if I look at my developer tools, actually it doesn't give me an error, but it should give me an error. Let's see if it gives me an error over here. Yeah, so, oh no, it doesn't give me an error. Okay, that's okay. I'm going to go over that, and then we'll, or I'm going to fix that, and then we'll go over the developer tools more. So the reason, you might have already figured out, the reason why the style sheet is not loading is because my hypertext reference is just looking at style.css, but my dog.html is inside of this pages folder, and so it can't see anything that's outside of the pages folder. So to get to style.css, I first have to leave the pages folder. And you may remember from last week, the way we do this is using ... and then / for folder. And so now if I reload this, we see the new styles that I added here. So to finish this off, I can just copy this and go over to cat.html and paste this in here. And so now all of my pages should have these styles attached. Okay, so there's a lot more stuff we can do. I'm gonna let you guys play around with some of the other styles. So far, I've really only added a body style with a few defaults that apply to everything. And then I added one specific style for my header, which just changes the font of the header. So you can add more styles. You might want to change the color of your links. You might want to change the font of your paragraphs. You could change the size of the images using CSS. You have a lot of different options. I'm going to let you guys explore that. We will go over a bunch more stuff in the second part of class. But first, one last thing is how can we actually see these rules and how they apply? There's a really convenient thing inside of Chrome and most browsers these days called the developer tools, which will actually show me all of the rules and HTML and everything that's making a website look the way it looks. So if I open up my website in a separate window and I go to the menu here and go to Tools and then go to Developer Tools, it's going to open up this little sidebar. And when you open it up, it may be on like a random tab up here. We want to go to the Elements tab. And the Elements tab shows us both the HTML and the CSS that make up the website. And so we can do what's called inspecting the website. So we can click on different components and see how they're being developed. So if I click on my paragraph here and click Inspect, it's going to go to this paragraph and show me where that is. If I want to inspect the font for this header, I can context click. So I'm holding Control and clicking and going to Inspect. And it'll open this H1. And I can see this is the rule that sets the font. And that's where it comes from in my style sheet. And I can also toggle this off to see what happens if I toggle it off. So if I toggle off this rule, then it goes back to this body rule from earlier. And so it changes the font family to Georgia. And if I toggle off that rule, then we go back to the default rule, which is the user agent style sheet rule that we see here. So we can try different rules. When I do this, it only updates the website. It doesn't actually change my code. So I can preview different stuff. For example, if I wanted to see what the H1 would look like with a different color, I can say color here. And I could cycle through these different color options. Maybe I can choose this one. Maybe I can click on this color picker and find one that looks good. And I can copy the hex value here. So I could copy that. And then if I want this to actually take place, I have to go back to my actual code and add it in here. And now I will have changed the color. So now we can see that color rule here. And I can toggle that on and off. If I toggle off, or if I change this color rule, it's going to change the entire, all the colors that it applies to. And so that's how we can see how a website works. You can do that with any website. So for example, if I'm on the color names website and I want to know what font this is, I can right click and inspect. And whoops, there's that paragraph. And we can see the color. This is a little bit more complicated CSS stuff, but what we want to do is just look through until we find font family. And here we go. Here's the font family. It's a font called Proxima Soft. And so if I wanted to use that font, I could Google Proxima Soft font. And this is an Adobe font. And so if I wanted to use this, I could probably maybe license it since I have an Adobe license. They might have some information about, okay, keeps reloading for some reason. I think the Adobe website is freaking out, but let's see if we can, I want to click on the licensing information. Okay. So it says the full Adobe fonts library is cleared for both personal and commercial use. So it's basically saying I can use this font. I might look into this a little more if I was making like a commercial website, But it looks like I can use this. They actually have their own button, says add to web project. This is probably taking me somewhere else that I don't really want to go, but maybe this would actually do what I want it to do. But anyway, so we can inspect other websites to find out how they work. And as we add more rules, we'll see the rules kind of add up on this page here. Another thing you can do is the sources tab. This will actually show you like the full HTML and CSS. So that's another thing that you can see on other websites if you're curious to see what it looks like. So there's a lot of different tools when it comes to web development that make it easier to understand what's happening with a website. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I'll give you guys some time to kind of play around with those different rules and continue working on your choose your own adventure story. In the second part of class, I'm going to go over layout. So we haven't really talked about how to change like the dimensions or the where the text shows up or other things like that. So we'll look at how to do that with a few layout rules. But what I would do now is just try playing around with different styles, Googling how do I do this. Just think of different things that you would want to do and see if you can find the correct CSS properties and rules to make that work.